So, we've talked a lot about schemas in this chapter and the idea of automatic versus controlled thinking. So, we're going to continue on to talk about some of those things that influence how we interpret situations and how we can be primed by other things. So, just continuing on with that theme. So, the interesting thing is that unconscious thinking or subconscious thinking is extremely powerful and really does impact how we act and can change how other people react to certain situations. So we don't even realize how many factors that are outside of our conscious awareness that influence how we interpret a situation and how we act, especially when there's such thing as, like, for example, competing goals. Do I act in a kind way? Uh, Maybe I want to, donate money to this cause, but I am strapped for cash, or, there's something that's sort of competing internally. Maybe you want to be a kind person, you want to be empathetic, but then you feel negativity toward a person or toward a situation. And so we find that certain behaviors can be primed even if there are self-interest conflicts with, for example, sharing with others and things like that. So if you might find that in situations where, let's say, you're outside of Walmart and it's around Christmas time and you see the Salvation Army, you see people giving to the kettle for Salvation Army, and somebody walks by and gives a $20 bill, that might actually influence if you donate. How much you donate, and can actually prime certain charitable behaviors and altruistic behaviors and goals. So we can actually see that certain kinds of generosity can actually be primed by somebody else engaging in that particular behavior before you. Um, we are often unaware of the influence of those priming actions on our own decisions. Um, and so, if you want somebody to donate more money, maybe you would put a higher amount of money in a see-through bin, or maybe no money or very little money, to try to prime someone else into giving, or have somebody give right in front of you so that it feels like, oh, well, I'm obligated to give as well. And a lot of times we're not conscious of these sort of priming behaviors. Another thing that can influence schemas and determine schemas is culture. So, one thing that's important to notice is schemas are culturally universal, meaning that every single person has schemas or has the potential to have schemas. Now, we've talked about situations like Korsakoff syndrome where there's brain damage, and there's, of course, situations and diseases and trauma and damage that can influence schema development or accessibility. But generally speaking, a neurotypical person is able to have and develop schemas. Um, so when I say that it's culturally universal, I mean that it doesn't matter your race, ethnicity, it doesn't matter your environment, where you came from, what part of the world you lived in. Everybody has schemas. The cultural difference has come specifically with content of schemas. What makes up your schemas? So if you grew up in Japan, or if you grew up in Canada, or if you grew up in a country in Africa, you're going to have a different set of schemas about different things, groups of people, places, events, ways to act, compared to somebody who might have grown up in, Alabama versus, somewhere else in the United States. So the fact that we all have schemas, that's culturally universal. Culturally universal. um, what makes those schemas up is dependent upon where we grew up and the culture uh, of what we experience. So the content is impacted by culture, not the fact that we have them. So if I were to give you a few minutes, and you can pause the video to just kind of look at the two pictures here and see if you can figure out the difference between the two photos. So if you want to pause it and go ahead and look at the different pictures, go ahead. But once you're done with what you can find, I'm going to go ahead and kind of show you guys some of the differences. So, um, bringing it back here, uh, looking from point to point, you can see that, for example, the towers look different. The placement of this right here, it's taller and or more forefront than that. Um, there's a lot of differences here. I'm just going to pick up just a few of them. You can see here that, there's windows here, but not here. You can see that there's landing gear, but there's no landing gear here. If you look at the front here, you can actually see the wheels, whereas this helicopter's more forward. There's a lot of differences in each of these pictures. And what's interesting is that the way that you would look for differences in the pictures um, is actually different. You would actually have a different strategy based on where you grew up and what you sort of identify with in terms of culture. So there are actually different thinking styles when it comes to social cognition. So remember that culture impacts content schemas, and culture can impact your thinking style. It doesn't mean that you aren't capable of a particular thinking style. It just means that you tend to see one being used over the other in situations in Eastern versus Western cultures. So in Western cultures, which would be more like, United Kingdom, England, would be more American, sort of Western thinking styles, or Western cultures, you would see a more analytic thinking style. This would be that we tend to focus on objects without really thinking about the surrounding context. We looked at people versus the groups that they're in. Um, and if you identify more with like an Eastern culture, like more Asian culture, you would end up focusing on the overall context. So the relationship between objects. So looking back on this picture, looking at the individual parts versus where something is in relation to something else, for example, would be what you might notice first. So a more analytic style would be looking at the little individual parts, whereas a more holistic thinking would be looking at relation between one thing to another. And so this can actually sort of change what we're exposed to in terms of priming and our thinking styles. But remember that just because a person might grow up in a Western culture doesn't mean that they're not incapable of holistic thinking style. It just means that we tend to see the analytic thinking style being used primarily over holistic in certain situations and vice versa. Now, another thing to consider when we talk about social cognition and specifically controlled thinking is the idea of free will. So remember that controlled thinking is that very conscious, intentional, voluntary, very effortful thinking where we're really thinking through things. And we actually see that there's a pretty strong relationship or association between conscious thought and behavior, and this idea of creating this perception of free will. Okay. And so what we find is that there's actually a relationship between people who feel like, who believe in free will, right? And feel like humans have more free will. And we actually see that those individuals tend to be more likely to help other people in need. They tend to be less likely to engage in moral actions such as cheating because they feel like they're in control of their behavior. And the belief in free will actually can predict certain behaviors in cheating and helping. So the more likely that you believe that you have free will and you're in control of your own behaviors and your destiny, you're actually more likely to help and you're less likely to cheat. So we can sort of under or overestimate our degree of control in particular situations and what we think is actually happening in terms of situation. And an example of this is a really interesting event that happened, circled around something called facilitated communication. This idea of free will and being able, if you're in control versus not in control. So this right here is an example of what we call a sort of facilitated communication device. So there was a period of time where there was a very exciting finding that people who were unable to express themselves, for example, they might be mute, they're nonverbal, with the use of a particular device and a person who could facilitate the communication, that person here who is nonverbal could, with the guidance of the facilitator, by holding their hand, right, and guiding them across the board, that they could actually communicate. And so remember this is the idea of how in control are you? Okay. And so this was a really, really big sort of debatable event. Oh my goodness. Now we finally get to hear people who are nonverbal. We get to hear their voice because these facilitators are able to use these machines to get to hear what these kids are saying and these adults are saying who are unable to speak for themselves. So the problem was facilitated communication kept the same sort of issue kept cropping back up where we kept saying, well, are these people who are nonverbal, are they the ones actually talking with this device, or is it the facilitators? And so, of course, with science and the scientific method, we decided as a community, okay, well, we need to research this and figure it out for ourselves. We put a lot of confidence in the fact that the nonverbal people were able to actually communicate. So it turns out that when the facilitator had on headphones, okay, and were listening to prompts, and the person who was nonverbal had another set of headphones and they were listening to some other prompts, the facilitator was answering the questions that they heard on their headphones, did not these. So if the question was, how are you doing today? They might answer, I am doing fine. This person might be hearing in their headphones, what did you eat for lunch? Okay. And so because the answers corresponded with what they heard, that gave evidence that the people who were nonverbal were actually not answering the question. But here's the thing, you might go, oh my goodness, I can't believe this facilitator, how terrible, they're doing it on purpose. Turns out that the facilitators had no idea this was happening. And they sincerely believed that they were facilitating the communication from what they were saying. And it was really disappointing because we really there was this overestimation that this person was in control and not this person. And so this is an example where we see that sometimes we can underestimate our degree of control in a particular situation. And so this facilitated communication isn't used in the same fashion anymore because it was determined that it actually wasn't true. It was just the facilitator actually creating answers and saying things. And so it was unfortunate, but it was important that we learn the truth in that. So another thing that we can find that can impact how we think about things and how we interpret situations and our experiences is something that we refer to as counterfactual reasoning. So this is a particular cognition that we use where we actually determine to what degree are we sort of able to mentally change some aspect of the past. And then we sort of uh, redo that thing in our mind and say, well, what could we have done? So maybe you get a test back and you got one answer wrong. And that one answer meant that you don't pass the class, that you get an F. Okay. And getting that one answer wrong changed your outcome drastically. And you go, oh my goodness, if I had just answered that one question, I would have passed the test and passed the class. Our reaction to how we engage in this kind of reasoning can influence our emotional reaction to the current event and future events. The easier it is for us to be able to mentally undo an outcome, the stronger we're going to feel, the stronger the emotional reaction that we're going to feel to it. So, that one question, it was just that one question. If we would have just changed that one thing, then things would have been different. Now, if you bombed that test and you bombed the class and you were nowhere close to passing, then that would be much further away. It would be much harder to mentally undo that. You'd be like, well, I should have studied more. I should have added more time in. And you would have a whole list of slew of things to undo to change your course or path. Whereas the easier it is to just change one little thing, then you go, okay, well, now you're going to harp on that, and you're going to have a hard time with that. And because you're going to have this stronger emotional reaction to that one little thing that could have changed, it's going to be harder for you to move past it. We find that people who suffer the loss of like a spouse or a child, if they continue to imagine all these different ways they could have done or could have happened to avert tragedy, the more that they think about imagining these different ways, oh, if they left 5 minutes earlier, or oh, if I would have, done this one thing, or oh, if I would have changed this, the more ways that they're imagining how they could have averted tragedy, that was actually associated with greater distress. So the more times you mentally undo this, and the easier it is for you to think about this, then the more likely it's going to affect you more drastically. And we also see this in sports. So this is a really interesting thing. So I've got this picture here, where we see three athletes. Okay, and so this is a really interesting thing that you can actually do on your own. So we see counterfactual reasoning happen when we see cases of people, in the case of sports, not winning a particular placement because perhaps there was a really close time, like let's say they're running a race, or in this case they're swimming, right? And the difference between first and second place is just a fraction of a second. Oh my goodness, if I would just swam a little faster, if I would have just, not taken that breath and gone a little bit harder, I would have gotten first place. What we find is that people in sports, okay, we find that silver medal winners, so those people who place second, often express greater dissatisfaction than bronze medal winners who are third place, right? So the silver person who won the silver medal may imagine ways that they could have placed first and won gold, whereas the medal winner are probably going the opposite way and imagining ways that they could have changed things where they wouldn't have won a medal at all. So bronze medal winners are super psyched just to be there. They're like, I'm on this podium. I'm just happy to be here, y'all. Whereas silver medalists are like, man, just I was so close to gold. So if you look at pictures of people, of Olympic athletes, gold, silver, and bronze, if the person who won silver is engaging in counterfactual reasoning, where they're mentally undoing what they did, and man, I just changed this one thing that I could have won, you can often see it in their face. So looking at these winners, these medal winners, I want you to take a moment out of these three. Which one do you think won the silver medal? Because a lot of times you can see it written all over their face. So I'm gonna give you a second to think about it. I think it's pretty obvious. Pick which one you think won the silver medal based on his facial expression. And then let's see what happens. Trying to click, let's go. So if you picked this guy, you are correct. He got the silver medal. Okay, we've got the gold medalist and the bronze medalist here. Super happy. He's just happy to be here. Okay, this guy, look at his tight mouth. Okay, you can see here, he's not even touching it. He's like, I don't want to touch this medal. I'm so mad, right? These guys here are holding it. They're super happy, got the flowers, excited, ready to go. So those silver medalists tend to be less happy because they're engaging in that counterfactual reasoning. Now, counterfactual reasoning can be a good thing, okay? One good thing, one positive consequence is that it motivates you to be better. Okay? So if you're an athlete, for example, and you did something wrong, well, next time I'm going to strive to be better. I'm going to work harder. If you did poorly on a test in a class, well, man, you know what could I have done to make this better? What could I have changed? Oh man, I could have studied one more hour, or I could have not gone to that party and instead, done this. And then you engage in motivating behaviors that actually make you better the next time around. However, there are some negative consequences, of course, to counterfactual reasoning. And it can lead to something called rumination. Now, rumination is this repetitive focus on negative thoughts, negative things. And what we find is that depression we see in depression, we see ruminating thoughts, focus on the negative over and over. And of course, that can be problematic for a person's mental health. So engaging in that rumination can sometimes is a lot of times associated with a depression. And so you want to make sure that you don't engage in that too much, right? So this is a nice summary slide. If you guys have any questions about the chapter, please feel free to email me and use this to help you study for the quiz that's coming.